So annual conference now finishes on Saturday night with the big ordination service. And we had 3 pastors from our district from Hawaii that were commissioned at our ordination service, and that was exciting, including John Sione Finau, our pastor at Kailua. So he was part of that ordination service. On Sunday morning, I had the privilege of preaching at the 10th year anniversary of Kailua United Methodist Church. And a little background on that, the first church I served was Ascension Ministry, the English ministry of Kailua, LA Korean United Methodist Church. Ascension Ministry was founded by Reverend Tom Choi and is the English ministry of this Korean church. So our oldest members were in their late 40s because this was a second generation church. So we had folks in their 40s, 30s, 20s, and college students. And it was a strong church. It was a really family environment. Everyone knew each other. It was a place where people saw their friends together each week. But they also, I think as a second generation, at times it was hard being part of that first generation church. And also there was a sense that even though it's a good kind of church family, we get to see our friends every week, we're not really living out our mission fully, which is to make disciples of Jesus Christ, which is to make an impact in our community. So my last year at that church, we did something new and risky. We merged with West LA First UMC. We merged with a church that was about 5 or 6 miles away, a brand new congregation. And that merger was a big risk for our church. It meant leaving the Korean church that our church had always been part of. It meant merging together 2 generations, because as I said, our church topped out at 50. That church we merged with, the average age would be in their mid-70s. It was what we call a legacy congregation, about 20 people, all with gray hair and kind of on its way out, so to speak. But it was merging 2 generations, this older generation with the younger. It was merging 2 cultures, because West LA First was pretty much all Caucasian, and our church, besides me and a few others, was all Korean. And so it was bringing these 2 churches together. And this was such a kind of like, I don't know if this is going to work, that we made it a 10-year process. In our memorandum of understanding, we basically said, either group has 10 years in which they can pull out of this. And so last Sunday, the engagement was finally over. Last Sunday was the 10-year anniversary of this church, which changed its name to Kailua UMC. And I had the privilege of preaching there. And it was so exciting for me to see how this church has come together, these different generations, these different cultures, and is reaching out to the neighborhood. The vision of this church is to be a blessing to the world. Their focus this year for doing this is to be local, relational, impactful congregation. And I share that just because for me, being there and being part of that worship service was a reminder that as we say yes to God, yes to where God is leading us, as we seek to be faithful to God, God is faithful to us. Amen? And I celebrate the ways that God has worked in our church and in the churches throughout our conference. So today, as I shared with the children, we're starting a new series called Summertime. And I love summertime. Anyone else love summertime? I love summertime. And in this series, we want to look at some of the activities associated with summer and explore the spiritual significance of these activities, and in particular, how they feed our soul. And we're going to begin this morning by looking at rest. Summertime is a time to rest, take a break. And we want to look in particular at Sabbath rest. And I want to share with you a conversation I had with someone at annual conference that I've been thinking about ever since this conversation. I was manning a booth for new ministries because I'm part of the new ministries team for our conference. And Curtis Brown was there. Curtis Brown is a pastor who works for the National Methodist Church in charge of new church plants, new ministries. And his focus is on discipleship. And he was sitting next to me. And he and his wife live in the Tacoma, Seattle area. They live near Joint Base Lewis McChord. There's 2 bases now, Joint Base now. And his wife is also a pastor, and she started a new church in that area. And most of the folks in her church are military families. And as we were sitting there talking, at one point, Curtis said to me, the number 1 spiritual practice that we focus on in our church is Sabbath rest. Learning how to take a Sabbath rest, understanding what that means and actually doing that. That's our top priority. That's our most important practice. And he said that's true because our folks simply don't do that. They're not good at that. It's really hard for them to not do anything, to not accomplish anything, to not be productive, but just to rest. Now, my friend Brent Ross, who's a pastor in San Diego, he was sitting there, and he started talking to us. He said, well, what exactly does that mean? And then at one point he said, how about working in my garden? Would that count as Sabbath rest? And Curtis looked at him and said, well, it depends on your motivation and your mindset. Is that something on your to-do list that has to get done? Or is that something, an activity that would renew your soul? So this conversation got me thinking. And it reminded me of a conversation I had years ago with another pastor. His name is Matt, and he was a church planner in San Diego. He planted an Episcopalian church. And he was super busy starting this new church, but also working a part-time job in addition to that. And he basically got overextended, and he kind of crashed and burned, and he quit. And he entered into a time of personal study, specifically on rest and on Sabbath rest. And during that study, he came across this quote from Wayne Mueller that I want to show you guys. We have it on the screen, hopefully. Wayne Mueller writes this: all life requires a rhythm of rest. We have lost this essential rhythm. Our culture invariably supposes that action and accomplishments are better than rest, that doing something, anything, is better than doing nothing. Because of our desire to succeed, to meet these ever-growing expectations, we do not rest. Because we do not rest, we lose our way. So for you personally, how much do you prioritize rest? In what ways do you have a rhythm of rest? How have you learned what it means to take a Sabbath rest? Who has taught you that? And if you are a parent, how are you teaching that practice to your kids? The reason I think these are such important questions is because we live in a world where, thanks to technology and other factors, we seek to cram more and more into our schedule. We live in a world, as a Sprint ad once put it, where we can say yes to making virtually any place a workplace. And there are several consequences to this dynamic in which we live. One is that many of us do not get enough sleep. For many people, sleep deprivation is a badge of honor. We brag about how little sleep we get, thinking that the busier we are, the more important we are. And we pass on this lie, this modern delusion, that we can go about life and do our work just as well on 4, 5, or 6 hours of sleep as we can on 7 or 8. Well-known businesswoman Arianna Huffington used to think this way and live this way until she collapsed from exhaustion in 2007. And ever since then, she has been leading a rally cry to change the way we think about and practice sleep. And as she points out, the irony is that a lot of people forego sleep in the name of productivity, but in fact, our productivity drops significantly when we're sleep deprived. I see this even with school kids nowadays. Now, there's a lot of research on sleep. And because of this research, we know the benefits of sleep. I want to highlight some of them. I have just a few of these on the slide. This isn't going to be anything new, but we know the benefits of sleep. Sleep helps our immune system. If we're sleep deprived, we're more likely to get sick. Sleep helps our mental health. People who are sleep deprived are more likely, more prone into depression, things of that nature. Sleep reduces our levels of stress. Those who are sleep deprived, more likely to fall into hypertension. Sleep helps us manage our weight. When we're tired, what kind of food do we turn to? Junk food, sugary food. Research shows this, life shows this. And sleep helps our brain develop and function. As I shared with the children's sermon, research is really clear. If we want to be bright, if we want to be at our top mentally, sleep is important, essential in that process. So we know the advantages, the benefits of sleep. Yet, because of the digital revolution in which we live, we have a hard time disconnecting from our technology and actually going to sleep. And our attachment or addiction to digital devices does not help. Case in point, 71% of Americans sleep next to their smartphones. Do any of you sleep next to your smartphone? All right. Now, I never did until the last year. Until last year, my smartphone always went into the kitchen, and that's where it got charged. Say goodnight to it, go to bed. But then we had to start waking up our oldest son, Micah, at 5:50 for school. And I didn't trust my alarm clock because if the power goes out, it just starts blinking and doesn't work. So ever since then, I've had my smartphone, and iPhone has a nice little music that wakes me up every morning, right? But even in that year, I can see how having the smartphone, the light, the messages next to me on my nightstand does affect some of the patterns and habits for me around sleep. So one of my takeaways, one of my next steps from this sermon is to get a new alarm clock so that I can put my iPhone back in the kitchen and not have it on the nightstand. Given the culture in which we live, now more than ever, we need to take seriously God's command to rest. And in particular, take seriously God's command to observe the Sabbath rest. The Sabbath, which God models in Genesis, as we heard, and commands in Exodus as part of the 10 Commandments. The Sabbath is God's gift to us. The Sabbath is designed for our physical rest. The Sabbath is designed for our emotional rest. And most of all, the Sabbath is designed for our spiritual rest. As John Ortberg points out, our soul craves rest. You know, our bodies at times just do super well with getting pushed hard. Bodies love that at times. Even our minds do really well being stretched at times. But our soul craves rest. The soul knows only borrowed strength. The soul was made to rest in God the way a tree rests in soil. That's why God commands us to set aside one day out of 7 as a day of Sabbath rest to the Lord our God. On the 7th day, we slow down to set our hearts and minds on God, to remember who God is and what God has done. Now, what does that look like? We don't want to become overly legalistic about it, because we see in the New Testament, when Jesus showed up, the religious leaders of his day were way too legalistic about Sabbath keeping, and they missed Jesus and his way in many regards because of that. We don't want to be overly legalistic, but Sabbath rest is something we have to learn. It is a spiritual practice that we have to develop. We don't meander our way. We don't accidentally fall into Sabbath rest. We only enter into it if we are intentional. And it's a practice that we have to develop and try out and experiment and grow in. When I first began practicing Sabbath rest was in college. I was part of a campus ministry that studied God's Word a lot. And we kept coming across this command to rest, to enter into Sabbath rest. And so we decided, let's try this out together. And we would do group Sabbaths, maybe 5 to 10 of us. Our college is in the Pasadena, Glendale area. Some of our favorite group Sabbaths would be to go to Huntington Gardens. There's a place called Huntington Library in Pasadena. Beautiful grounds, acres and acres. And we would go there. And each of us would have our Bible and our journal. And we would just individually walk around, pray, reflect, maybe hang out together. And then go to BC's, this great Greek restaurant in Pasadena. That would be one of our group Sabbaths. And the whole point was that we were learning what it means to take a Sabbath. Now, I know there aren't that many students here, but there are some. And as a student, we may be thinking, well, I don't have a full-time job necessarily, so maybe this doesn't apply to me. But the reality is that if you're a student, the disciplines, the practices you establish now are the ones you will live with for the rest of your life. If you don't learn to take a Sabbath rest now, the chances of learning that 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now are very minimal. So for me, as a student, I understood that my primary work was studying. So taking a Sabbath rest meant that one day a week I didn't study. Didn't matter if it was finals, papers due, one day a week, I didn't study. So I asked this question in approaching Sabbath rest. What is refreshing? What renews my soul? What connects me to God? Now for me, my day off, my day of Sabbath rest is Friday. For many years, my day off was Monday, and that was a lot easier to keep because Sunday's done, right? The weekend's over, and it's Monday. But now that Friday is my day of rest, what I've noticed over the last year or two is work has slowly just crept in there. And I used to be very diligent of guarding that Sabbath. But now that it's Friday, I can say, well, I'm not quite ready for my sermon. I'm going to go to Starbucks where I often see Grant. It's good to see many of you. I see many of you at Starbucks. Enchanted Lake, drop by if you want to see me. I'll be there working on my sermon. But, I've seen that has been creeping into my schedule just over time since I've, really in the last couple years. And because of this sermon this week, when Friday came, I said, I got to take a Sabbath rest. I can't preach this sermon and write this sermon on Friday. So I took a full day of Sabbath rest on Friday. Prayed, walked, read. Cindy and I caught a movie named Lion, which I highly recommend. But at times I was like, oh, I'm going to go. No, don't work on your sermon. Don't respond to those emails. Don't, make those phone calls. So I really need to be more serious for the sake of my own soul, for the sake of my own connection with God, of observing Sabbath rest. See, all of us are called to enter into Sabbath rest regardless of our particular season of life. And I know we have some very different seasons of life in this room. Eugene Peterson says this about Sabbath rest. I want to show you this quote. He writes, "The most striking thing about keeping the Sabbath is that it begins by not doing anything. The Hebrew word Shabbat simply means quit, stop, take a break." And then he says, if there is no Sabbath, no regular and commanded not working, we soon become totally absorbed in what we are doing. And God's work is either forgotten or marginalized. Now that's a good quote. I want to highlight two parts of it. First, I want to ask, how good are you at doing nothing? Now, some of you might say, if that's a class, I would get an A+. I am awesome at doing nothing. But my guess is that there are some of you, others of you, who have a hard time doing nothing. I was talking to my friend Chris Spearman. He serves a church in Westwood, UMC in Westwood. And he's around driven type A successful folks. And he said, I'm around parents and dads in particular who they come home after the kids have gone to bed and they work 7 days a week. And that's the world in which I live. And the people around him are not good at doing nothing. They don't know how. The other part of the quote that I want to highlight is where Eugene Peterson says, if there's no Sabbath, we soon become totally absorbed in what we're doing, and God's work is either forgotten or marginalized. That's true, isn't it? See, I think that's one of the biggest dangers for us. Not that we actively disobey God, but it's just that we get so busy in what we're doing that we don't have time or energy to be a part of what God is doing. We give God our leftovers. God's work is barely on our radar. It's not at the center of our lives. It is pushed to the margins. That, I think, is the danger for most of us. We believe in God. It's just that we're not part of the work that God's doing in the world. And as a parent, I have that concern for my own children and the schedule that our children live. Are they running around from activity to activity, so absorbed in what they're doing that God's work isn't on their radar at all? That, for me, is a challenge as a parent. The Sabbath is one way that we train ourselves to take God seriously. On the Sabbath, we turn to our work and say, you are not my master, God is. I am not trusting in you for my future. I'm trusting in God. And on the Sabbath, we turn to ourselves and say, I am not God. I'm not in charge. I'm not the master of my destiny. God is. Ultimately, rest is a secondary issue. The primary issue is trust. Sabbath rest is about trusting God. That's why in Exodus 34, God says, even in plowing time and harvest time, you shall rest. Even in crunch time at work, you shall rest. Even when you're working and taking that night class, you shall rest. God calls us to Sabbath rest so that we can learn to trust Him with our time. God is saying right up front, set aside this time for me and see what happens. See if I can be trusted. When you are at your busiest, I want you to set aside time to worship me and rest in me, and I want you to do so as an act of trust. Our culture says, schedule in all the work you need to do, then with the time that you have left over, get some rest. God says, schedule in the rest first. Schedule in the Sabbath. Put it in your calendar. Then with the other days of the week, get the work done that you can. The car company Ford used to say, the best never rest. I know that was a long time ago. The best never rest. See, and that's true if you're in charge and if you have to stay ahead of the competition. But what if God's in charge? What if we're called to trust in God rather than rely on ourselves? Summertime is a time to rest. And for some of us, the most important spiritual practice we need to develop is taking a Sabbath rest. Some of us here today are suffering from soul fatigue. Our soul was not made to run on empty. Our soul was made to rest in God. So I want to invite you to do that. I want to invite you to practice rest, to discover rest, to experiment and learn what it means to observe Sabbath rest this week or next week. It's not necessarily tied to a particular day of week, though for most of us it is tied to Sunday. It's the day in which we worship, but there are some, like myself, others who work on Sunday. So I'm not even focusing on the day of the week, but I am saying to put it in your calendar because it's not something we meander into. It's not something we fall into accidentally. It only happens if we're intentional about it. If we plan it, prioritize it. I want to invite you to do that, to experiment, to learn, to grow in what it means to take Sabbath rest. Sabbath rest is a radical way of saying we are not alone in the world. We have a Creator. And our Creator is good. Our Creator can be trusted. And knowing this, we are free to rest. Let's pray. God, thank you for the gift of Sabbath rest. And God, we acknowledge that we live in a world where we can make virtually any place a workplace. And we acknowledge that some of us have a hard time shutting down, doing nothing. And God, we admit that as a result, we can become so absorbed in what we're doing that your work, God, is forgotten or marginalized. God, I want to pray for those in this room right now who the idea, the reality of soul fatigue resonates with them. God, there's a fatigue to our body, there's a physical fatigue, there's a mental fatigue, but God, there is also a soul fatigue that is deeper even than those other ones. God, we were created, our soul was made to rest in you. And I pray that you would teach us what it means to practice, the countercultural practice in our world today of Sabbath rest.